Hi everyone, today we're going to be making a Qixiong Hanfu dress, which is my modern take on a Tang Dynasty classic. As you can tell by the name, this dress was inspired by the iconic Qixiong Ruqun. I've modernized the design by adding straps and giving it a maxi length, but you can totally adapt the pattern to your liking and make it the floor length traditional version with no straps. Now onto the construction. The pattern is not complicated to sew. If you've taken a look at the PDF, you'll notice that it's essentially many rectangles and you're sewing straight lines the whole time. Nothing crazy, very straightforward sewing. What can be complicated is the placement of your pieces. It's very easy to mix things up, so pay close attention to your notches and which side of the fabric you're working on. It can be confusing at first, so really take your time with this and feel free to reach out to me on Instagram if you need any help. I'll be briefly going through the printing and prep first, so check the description for timestamps if you'd like to skip around instead. Since this is my first tutorial, I'll be slowly going through the steps, but if you have the instruction book, you can absolutely just breeze through this as well on your own. But I think that's everything for the intro, so let's get started. I hope to see you at the very end. Don't give up on me. So the first thing you'll want to do is print just the first page of the pattern and measure the guide at the top. Once you've got that squared away, print the rest of the pattern and trim along the edges of your pieces. I recommend printing just your size if you're a beginner, since it's easy to get confused by all the markings. Tape your papers together according to the picture below and match up the hearts at the edges. Then cut out your pattern pieces. The pieces are listed A through F, which is the order we'll be sewing them in later. Before we move on to our fabric, notice the markings at the top. These notches are extremely important for placement, so please be careful and make sure you're notching only your size. You'll want to cut and notch your pieces from the wrong side of your fabric. If both sides of your fabric are more or less the same like mine, just pick a side and stick with it. Keep in mind that piece G is only a guide for pleating, so don't cut it out of your fabric. Moving on to the fabric, I'll wash and press out all the wrinkles, then true the edges. Truing is when you put your fabric back on grain, since the seller can cut it off grain. You can do this by tearing or pulling a thread on your fabric. I prefer to pull a single thread and cut along that pucker, since tearing can distort the edges. You don't always need to do this, but it helps everything line up super nicely. Now to cut out your pattern pieces. Again, it's very important to notch and cut from the wrong side. You can mark the wrong side like I am here, so you can be absolutely sure it doesn't get mixed up later. Now I'm just trimming off the excess at the top of my yardage, which will later become the skirt piece. Once everything is cut, we can start sewing. Take pieces A and B and press them in half. We're going to be sewing all of them like tubes. If you're doing ribbon straps instead, skip to the timestamp here and follow those instructions. Once you have everything pressed, sew around the strap pieces, leaving one end open. Trim the excess seam allowance and repeat for all the pieces. Then turn them right side out using a loop turner or safety pin. Anything thin and long will also work. And you just want to roll out the seam allowance between your fingers and then iron it. The reason I do this is because some of the seam just doesn't want to lay flat and gets hidden when you turn it out. Once you got them all ironed flat, top stitch around them to secure. Now to assemble the straps. This part can get tricky, so replay it as many times as you need to. You'll want to take the shorter strap, which is your piece A, and loop it through a slider. Then pin the bottom. We'll be basting that together later. Take the finished end of piece B and loop it up through the top hole and down through the bottom hole of a slider. Turn it to the back and fold that little tail up. We'll be stitching that down as close to the slider as possible. Again, I'm just basting the ends of A to hold them in place and stitching the flap of B down. Place your longer strap B with the stitched side facing up. Take the unfinished end and loop it through strap A. Then go up through the top hole, covering the flap that we just sewed, then down through the bottom hole again. Repeat this for the second set, and now you have your adjustable straps. This can be really confusing when you start, but I promise it's so easy once you get the hang of it, and you'll want to make all your straps adjustable after. Moving on to the chest ties, you should have 4 pieces total. I had extra green fabric, so I used that instead of my lining. You can also cut this on fold to get 2 long pieces instead of 4 smaller pieces, but this method is just easier if you don't have extra yardage. Place 2 pieces right sides together and sew to join them. Finish the raw edges however you like. I'm using my pinking shears, then press open. And this is my method to get really sharp ribbons. From the wrong side, fold up one end and press. Then press in half, right sides together as usual, and sew straight down, leaving both ends open. Take your time to trim the excess, turn it right side out, and press these super long pieces. And just like before, give it a top stitch all around to finish. This will close up the folded edge we made earlier, creating perfectly sharp corners. Set these aside and take out your bodice pieces next. You can add interfacing at this stage if you like, but I usually skip this step. Place your bodice pieces right sides up. I have F on my left side and E on my right. Make sure your notches line up as well. There should be double notches where they meet. I've also put some pins where my strap notches are so you can see it a bit better. Put your strap pieces in the bodice right sides together and pin using the center front as a guide. You could also flip the straps around if you don't want the hardware to show from the front. Add some extra pins if you feel like you need them, and after you have everything pinned, place your lining on top, right sides down, sandwiching the ties. Make sure those double notches at the sides match up, but it's okay if the notches at the top of the lining don't match. Sew right on that top edge to secure it all together and press the seam open, then press towards the lining. Again, you can pink or zigzag that seam if your fabric frays a lot like mine. Flip your bodice right sides up and stitch the seam allowance to the lining. This is called understitching. I'm sewing close to the seam and going slow, using my hands to hold it open. It's good to use your fingers to feel around for that seam allowance to make sure it hasn't flipped upwards. And if you get to any bulky parts, fold up a piece of fabric and place it under your presser foot. This will help the presser foot level out and sew over thick fabric. Once you're finished with that, you'll have a line of stitching that prevents your lining from rolling upwards. Put your bodice pieces right sides together, matching up the double notches carefully. We're going to sew these areas only, leaving the space between the notches open. This will create our slit. So you'll see here that I'm starting at the edge, then stopping once I reach the first notch. I'll skip over the center, then start sewing from my second notch until I get to the next one. Skip the center again, then sew from the last notch to the edge. You now have a slit for your chest ties to thread through later. Now I'm just marking 2.5 centimeters, or about 1 inch, all across my lining. This will go over our skirt piece like a waistband. For now, just fold your lining up to the marking and press. Set the bodice pieces aside and bring out your skirt piece, which is basically the rest of your yardage. I'm doing pleats today, but if you're sewing gathers, you can just sew 2 basting stitches at the top and gather it to the size of your bodice. For pleats, you want to use pleat guide G with your size on it. Line it up with the edge you just finished and mark from the right side of your fabric. Mark the top and bottom of the guide going along your selvage. When you get to the end of the guide, just line up the edge with your last set of markings and continue. Notice that I'm only marking the solid lines, not the dotted lines. And to form your pleats, you'll just want to match each row of markings to the next. Pin in place and press. So I forgot to film this part, but once you have your pleats, you'll notice the skirt may be longer than your bodice. To trim the skirt, line the edges of the skirt to the edge of your bodice. Mark this length and trim off any excess. If you're doing gathers, just gather it to the length of your bodice. You don't need to trim anything. Afterwards, you'll just finish the raw edges with a double fold. You'll want to finish both edges with a double fold. I folded 1 centimeter twice and stitched that down. Leave the top and bottom selvage areas unfinished. Once you have your pleats or gathers finished, pin your bodice on top, right sides together. Make sure that you still have seam allowance on either end of the bodice. If not, adjust the pleats at the end so you have this overhang. Then sew along the top edge to join the pieces together. Make sure you're not accidentally catching the straps or other parts of the skirt when sewing. Take your time and use a walking foot if you need it. Press the seam open, then press it towards the bodice. Then grab one of your chest ties and place it at the notch at the end of your bodice. Pin in place and fold the lining right over it, right sides together. The folded edge of your lining should be pinned down as well. Repeat this for the other side and sew down that seam allowance to secure. You can trim the seam allowance if you'd like, but I like to leave it as is and just use anything sharp and pointy to get all the corners out. Once you're finished with that, find the area where you sewed the slit and clip just a small triangle from underneath. This will prevent the seam allowance from showing through the hole later. Next, we're going to fold over and pin the lining, starting at the slit. Make sure it covers the original stitch line by a few millimeters. You can pin the slit down as well to hold it in place. Take your time to pin the rest of the lining down. We are so close to being done, guys, don't give up on me yet. After pinning all that lining down, we'll stitch in the ditch to catch it from the front. This means we'll sew right in the channel of the seam, but you can also just do a regular top stitch on the bodice to make it easier. Take your time with this and make sure nothing gets caught underneath when sewing. Afterwards, give the edges of the bodice a top stitch to secure those straps in place. Then top stitch around the slit as well so it doesn't slide around. You can also choose to sew this by hand if you want an invisible finish. Now for the very last step, you get to try on your dress and decide where you want your hem. Thread the tie on your right side through the slit, going under the strap. Pull to tighten and tie a bow. Then check where your hem is. For me, this is perfect, so I'm just gonna double fold here and sew it down. If it's too long for you, pin up to your desired length and add seam allowance before trimming. Here I'm just folding in 1 centimeter twice and sewing my hem down. It'll take a while since there's so much yardage to go through, but you'll get there, I promise. And you're done. Give yourself a pat on the back, your beautiful hanfu dress is now finished. This dress is just so flowy and fun, there's so much overlap that you don't really have to be worried about flashing anybody, and I really love the straps on this since the traditional version can fall down so easily. If you gave this pattern a try, send me a DM because I'd love to admire it with you. Thank you so much for being here with me, I'll see you in the next one.